It's my joy to welcome you to Mercer County Community College today, where we are all about learning and student success, which also happens to be the reason you're here today. I also serve as chair of the presidents for our Community College Council this year, and in that sense, I'm really thrilled to talk to you about why you're here today. Almost 5 years ago, with the trustees, the presidents started a process of examining where are we going? How do we make sure that our community colleges will be sustainable, that will be positioned to really serve our students and provide learning and student success into the future in a world that's quite different than when our colleges were formed 50 years ago, give or take a few for most of us. And while we came up with 8 big ideas, there are really 3 of them that are driving a lot of the program, are driving a number of summits we've had and statewide conferences, and why you're here today. Those 3 are improving developmental education, creating a success formula that really gets the people who come to our door into a successful learning pattern that allows them to get into college classes. Partnering with our K-12 institutions so that the transition for those students works better because we know that the learning outcomes are aligned, that the instruction has prepared the students, and hopefully that they're getting to our door ready to become a college learner. And the third major category that's driving what we're doing is our student success model. I'm not going to talk a lot about it, but a lot of work by our IR folks was spent looking at and mixing what comes out of the voluntary framework of accountability, what comes out of the Achieving the Dream statistics, what's going into performance funding models across the country now, with a major piece for us that we know we are not measured by a single factor. Just counting graduation rates is not the only measure of success for us. So one of the things we're all very focused on is recognizing for some of our students, completing a developmental sequence is a success we should recognize. Completing a first semester or a first year of their community college program is a success we should recognize. We are working on all of those things at the same time. I'm very glad that we have a great speaker to come and help us understand the national perspective on some of those things and be a catalyst for the conversation among us, because we know that no one of us is trying everything. Hopefully we're able to learn from each other's ideas, each other's big successes, each other's not so successful initiatives, because all of us have that same goal to really bring every student who comes to our door to as much success as a learner as we can possibly get for them. We are the creators of dreams. They come to us looking for their dream, and that's our job. It's my pleasure to bring up our fearless leader for the New Jersey Council of County Colleges, Dr. Larry Nespoli.
Boy, it's just great to see so many familiar faces here, and it's not often. We have 19 community colleges. It's not often we find a date and a program where all 19 can gather, and we're really thrilled that we have representatives from all 19 here today. And I want to start with I want to invite you to join with me in thanking Dr. Donahue, President Donahue. You know, these presidents they live 24/7 lives, and in the state level work we do, we're always so grateful that they take time to lead our statewide efforts. And President Donahue was elected last year to lead the statewide community college groups, and boy, she's just been a great leader for us. And I don't mind this at all, Pat, but you know, the phone will ring at 10 p.m., the phone will ring at 7 a.m., It's all good, but let's really thank her for hosting this as well. So I've got this friend, a good friend, Constantine, Greek descent, as you can gather. And as my introduction to today, I want to share his story, because it gets to an important point about the great work that you all do. Constantine is a brilliant mathematician. He worked in the Big Apple private sector, lost his job during the financial crisis of a couple of years ago. And so I guess maybe 3 or 4 years ago now, we were out shoveling the snow on a winter morning, and he was down in the dumps, of course, struggling. And we were talking, and one thing led to another, and I said, Constantine, until you get settled, you might enjoy teaching a course at a local community college. We're always looking for great adjuncts, and so he said yes, and I gave Eileen able to call at Raritan. He taught a course there, and turns out he was good at it. Turns out he loved it. Called Pat. He taught a course here at Mercer, loved it. And so fast forward a couple of years, and he's now a full-time math professor at Danville Community College in Virginia, and loving life. So we talk about once every 6 months or so, and he called last week, and this gets to my punchline that I wanted to share with you. I said, so how's it going? He said, just loving it, teaching a lot of developmental math. He said, Larry, the Greeks have a saying, to our parents, we owe our life. To our teachers, we owe a good life. And I really like that. To our teachers, we owe a good life. And I would broaden that a bit this morning. We're not all faculty here. But to educators, we owe a good life. And we're biased here, community college, strong and proud. And to community college educators, we really, really, many thousands, tens of thousands of people in our state owe a good life. So think about that. Surely you heard Pat touch on the statewide efforts our presidents are leading. And it's a national conversation, right? How many of you happened to be in Washington at AACC last week? Several of you. And, about 2 or 3 years ago, Rob, I guess it was, AAC issued a call to action, 21st Century Initiative. And just last week, an implementation guide called Empowering Community Colleges. And we're going to hear about some of that stuff today. So there's never been a more important time to be a community college educator, helping people to find a good life. But what I'm especially proud of is here in New Jersey, you heard Pat talk about the Big Ideas Project. Now, we started on this path, again, as you heard Pat say, about 4 years ago. And our presidents, I'm bragging on them here, and our trustees too, settled upon 8 big ideas, and you heard Pat mention a few of them. And if you look at our New Jersey big ideas and compare them with the national conversation, the AACCC effort, boy, they almost mirror each other. So I like to kind of tease Walter Bumpus and others that we got out early and we ended up in a very good place. And people are noticing. I think some of you know we got a substantial grant from the Secretary of Higher Education in New Jersey to partner with our high schools, calling it Early College Readiness Now. Some of you know about that. We'll talk about that today. We're one of 3 states a month ago to get a grant from the Kresge Foundation to support our statewide student success efforts. So lots and lots of good things happening. I want to call up the next 3 folks that are going to say a brief hello, and Guy and Mary and Jeremy, if you could come up, and then we'll want to hand off to Rob. And let me brag on these people as well. Here's how we do business in New Jersey. Trustees, presidents, they set the tone and the agenda tirelessly. And then we have these 8 affinity groups, we call them, that are the people who take the objectives and goals and the big ideas and they get to work. From the far right, Guy General's vice president here at Mercer, leads our academic officers. Now we have to pause for a minute, hit the pause button with Dr. Generals, because we're pleased, proud, and a bit sad. Some of you may have seen he's just accepted a position as president of the Community College of Philadelphia. So their gain, our loss. Jeremy from Warren County Community College chairs the Deans of Students, Jeremy Beeler. Jeremy, how long have you been at Warren now? 10 years, so he found a good home there and doing great work. And he chairs the statewide Deans of Students group. So we've got the academic officers engaged, student services folks play an important role as well. And Mary Morley from Ocean County College, the IR director at Ocean, chairs our statewide IR folks. And so this threesome, this team, taking the work of the presidents and moving the ball forward in so many important ways. So my last comment will just be to say how pleased we are that Rob Johnstone is with us. You know, if you look at the national conversations and the national literature, whether it's achieving the dream or completion by design, the work that Lumina's doing, whatever the national initiative is, more often than not, you'll find Rob playing a key role in it. So we're pleased we found a date on his busy schedule that worked for him, and pleased that he's able to join us here. I've got one more announcement, and Guy, you can maybe get us started then with your opening perspectives, and then the last one of you to do that can then hand off to Rob. But one logistics item that was asked to call to your attention. On the name badges, apparently, there is a group number. It's something to just kind of make a note of. And so after lunch, Rob is, I know, going to keep this very interactive. He's got lots of wisdom to share, but not one of us has the combined wisdom that all of you represent. So we're going to provide opportunity this morning, but in the afternoon session as well. When you come back in, look at your number, and our staff will guide you to a particular part of the auditorium. We've got space to do that. We wanted to, in a special way, make sure there was cross-college collaboration. So we're going to have, 6 or 7 or 8 people here from across different colleges, and 6 or 7 people there, and so on and so forth. So thank you all for being here. Thank Rob for joining us, and think of Constantine throughout the day, and the great work that you do in giving people a good life. And Guy, if you get us started here.
I'm honored to be here. I'm thankful that you guys were able to get here this morning. This is a very important next step, if you will, in the process of both transforming, redesigning developmental ed, as well as finding ways to work with our partners in the K-12 community. We've been very busy in both of those, with both of those endeavors. But before I describe what we've done, I'd like my colleagues to take a bow. The Vice President of Academic Affairs, I know Dwight is here and Eileen is here. If you could just stand up and take a quick bow. Come on, Eileen, stand up and take a quick bow. Thank you. The other 17 are obviously very busy, so they weren't able to get here this morning. We've, as Larry indicated, have taken the lead, if you will, in trying to foster changes and activities in an effort to redesign, to revisit this whole issue of developmental education. Over the last 4 years, there have been a lot of initiatives, a lot of activities, both curricular, both in terms of theory and policy. And we think we've made some progress, but it's a work that's ongoing and it is continuous. And so this culture of evidence and towards a culture of inquiry and action is very important because we have the data. Pat mentioned that we have a new success model. Hopefully we'll be able to look at some of that data today. In terms of some of the changes that have been made, many of you know that we've introduced decision zones, we've introduced content-based developmental education programs. We've looked at modularizing the programs. We've looked at requiring college success courses and a whole host of other things. And maybe Jeremy will talk about some of those things as well. So the principle that we've acted with is the idea that no one size fits all. And so by engaging our faculty and the practitioner, those of you who are out in the audience, with what the particular needs are for the students that we serve or that you serve on your campus, we've come up with this entire list and an entire package of services and educational opportunities for our students, and we think that it's working. And so it's a process that's continuous and it's ongoing. We need to stay on top of it, and I hope that we continue to do that. The other big thing is the idea that we are really structurally partnering with the K-12 community. Through the College Readiness Program, we've been able to get some resources. As you know, that's usually the proof in the pudding, and if we get resources behind our efforts. Many of the efforts had been happening before we actually got the money, so now we're able to double down on those efforts because we do have money from our Secretary of Higher Education, and as Larry indicated, and if he hasn't, I'll indicate we have possibility, well, we do have grant support in addition to the monies that we receive from the State Department, from our Secretary of Higher Ed. So some of those projects have to do with assessing our students who will be our students in their junior year, tying those assessments to different types of developmental pedagogies or developmental strategies, if it is in fact what they need, and utilizing their junior year to prepare them to move into their senior year. We're tying those successes into dual enrollment programs, both in math and English. So we have, again, across the state, a variety of programs that are working for the particulars of your communities, and we're very excited about that. Those programs will go into effect this summer. Some of them are actually going on as we speak. We'll have results. Everything we do, we're looking to gather data and to look at the results, to make modifications based on those results, and to move our efforts forward. So it's an exciting time. I know that you're excited about listening to Rob Johnstone. I'll bring Jeremy up. He'll tell you what's going on with student affairs. I'm old enough, let me just tell you very quickly, to tell you that at some point, and Betty can prove this, that I was also the chair of the student affairs group at one point in my life. And even back then, we were dealing with some of the same issues. So this is an ongoing process. It really is a societal issue that we have to continue to fight against and to fight to enable our students to be successful. So thank you. Have a great day, and I'll introduce Jeremy.
I think for all of us, this is a particularly appropriate time of year to have this discussion, because for me, this is really the time of year when student success is most obvious. Our students have just recently gotten midterm grades. If we have interventions like at Warren, where students who are struggling with their midterm grades meet with academic advisors, those programs are taking place and starting to wrap up. Many of our withdrawal deadlines have come up recently, so there's been a lot of conversations with students about, can I be successful? What types of strategies can I do to succeed and complete this course? And we're all starting to plan our commencement ceremonies, which is really kind of the culmination of sort of the archetype of what we consider to be success in completing their degrees. So certainly there are many things happening on our campus that are kind of guiding us and really encouraging us to have these conversations. Just yesterday, I had a long conversation with a student who was struggling in a developmental math class, had gone to tutoring, had done everything he needed to do, had good attendance, had done his homework, just wasn't getting it. And for him, it was a conversation about, maybe we can take a step back. Let's look at what you've learned. Let's continue to go to class, but perhaps we need to think about taking this class again. And so helping him then to look at the summer so that while it's fresh in his mind, he can move forward, decide what didn't work this semester so he can do something differently and not just repeat the same behavior again. But in his case, it was really an important conversation because unlike many of our students, he didn't want to give up. He wanted to keep trying, he wanted to keep working, and I think that's what we really need to cultivate in order for student success to happen on our campuses. About a year ago, the President's Council asked the Dean of Students group to look at this issue of student success and to put together a white paper addressing what we thought were some of the most important issues around student success. And some of our members took the lead on this. Dr. Betty Simmons, who's here today from CCM, along with Dr. Paula Pando from Hudson, Dr. Ralph Ford, who at the time was at Union, and Rich Pfeffer from Brookdale, authored a terrific paper. If you haven't read it yet, you should ask your student affairs officer for a copy. But it highlighted some of the most important things that we thought we could do on our campuses to really improve student success. Things like mandatory new student orientations, mandatory academic advising and academic planning, and first-year experience courses. So we're now taking those ideas that they researched among colleges all around the country and looking within New Jersey to find who's really doing really great things in these areas. And Raritan's one example. Diane Lemko really has done a great job with academic planning at Raritan. And so they're a model for the rest of us. They're still improving their process. It's not perfect yet, but they're certainly light years ahead of where many of us are in this really important thing for student success. So I think this is a really good time for us to come together to talk about our successes, to talk about our challenges, and to figure out how we can move ahead and really help our students to be successful. So I thank you all for coming today, and I appreciate your being here. I'm going to introduce Mary Morley. She's the Director of Institutional Research, and she's the Chair of the Institutional Research Affinity Group.
Okay, big idea 3, it says develop a more comprehensive student success model that considers entering student skill level impact on success within a defined period of time. We did that. Okay. We started with the 2008 group, looked at both full and part-time, looked at college-ready, developmental, English as a second language, pulled in other measures of success, not just did you graduate, but did you transfer to a four-year school without graduating? And if you didn't do that, did you at least earn 30 college-level credits with a C or better? Okay. That may not sound like much, but if you look at some of the data from the Heldridge Institute, they will show you that if you earn 24 college-level credits, that improves your income. So that is actually a real success. Okay. So the problem is, what are we going to go from here? Well, the easy part is to extend it to other cohorts and to extend it from the 3-year time frame to the 6-year time frame. You know, if you're not familiar with community colleges, 6 years for a 2-year program, that doesn't sound right. But if you're talking about students who are attending part-time and start at a low level of developmental, a 6-year time frame is not an unreasonable time frame to look at. So that's important. Even more important is the second thing, and that is to use the data. Okay. IR people love data, but we don't really spend all of our time and energy getting huge data sets so we can go, wow, look at that pretty data. Okay, we do, but that's not the point. Okay. Down here it says use data to track long-term improvement of the sector. Okay. That's nice, but that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is to use the data to get the improvement. The full data thing has 147 different data elements in it. So we're going to start analyzing at the state level, but even more important is to look at it for your college. Okay. So if somebody takes a student success course their first semester, does that mean better retention? Does it mean they're more likely to complete developmental? The answers are all there. And when we look at the state level, that may obscure a success that's at your college, because we all do developmental and other things a little bit differently, and we have a different student population. So please analyze your data and use it to improve. This is our main speaker, Dr. Rob Johnstone, and he's going to talk about from a culture of evidence to a culture of inquiry and action.
You can see she was prepped for that moment right there. That was really well done, Mary. All right, thanks, guys. So, hi, my name is Rob Johnstone. I'm happy. I'll give you a little bit of my background so you can see why this bozo in the Hawaiian shirt's talking to you for the next couple hours. We're going to make this really interactive. There's going to be a lot of questions I'm going to be asking you. You're not going to be sitting on your hands this whole time because I really won't let you. My background, I have a doctorate in social psychology from the University of Oregon, actually in jury decision making. I did a lot of my doctoral research on race and the death penalty. I worked with one of the leading people who got the death penalty stricken down in the mid-'70s because of the racial component of it, and we worked on how juries make decisions about the death penalty. And so I was doing this research in the mid-1990s on race and the death penalty with mock jury trials of students and other people from the community. Anyone think of anything going on in the jury system in the mid-1990s? The legal system? I was literally doing my jury research during the O.J. Simpson trial. Right, and I was in Oregon, but it was in California. So at no point until Nancy Grace came along was there any more interest in the legal system. And don't get me started on that, by the way. That is a whole thing. That can take an hour and a half by itself. But I was doing this research on jury decision making, so I joked that I couldn't replicate any of my results because we'd be doing these mock juries with students. They'd want to stop and ask questions about the OJ trial. Like, you're here for a jury decision, you know. So it was not all that useful. I went into industry for a couple years. I worked about 6 years as a strategic consultant in industry. So a lot of where I come at this is kind of a fusion of my higher education side and my industry side. I worked in the late 1990s during the data explosion and in the early 2000s with when data hit industry the way it hit higher ed, as with most things, about 10 years later. So I've got a lot of battle scars from that world that we can talk about, and I'll fold in, and I have one little rant I go off that I do allow myself, which is about dashboards. I'll go off on the dashboard rant when I get to it in the presentation. But I worked in industry for about 6 years, and I landed back in the community college system completely by accident. My dad actually played football at a community college in California, and I was working on Monster.com in 2002 for my next job, and happened to come across Dean of Institutional Research at Foothill College. I'm like, I don't know Didn't my dad play football there? So I threw in an application, and this is probably the most important moment in my life because I happened to have this skill set of, have a background of strategic consulting, had a doctorate in social psychology, I taught statistics. I just landed in this world of institutional research, which I knew nothing about. There's a whole other discussion about how people end up in institutional research, right? There's no programs, there's one or two nationally. People just end up there, and so I happened to land at a place. The day I got there, the dean of language arts came up to me and had a list of 30 research questions they'd been waiting to ask the researcher when we finally hired someone. And these, by the way, I have never seen a better list than this list. This was a great list of research questions. It took 3 years to get through. But it really, I happened to land at this campus where they had this really developed culture around data use before they even had data. We're going to talk about this today. It's not about the data. It's actually about the questions you're asking. And the data helps you get some insight into. So I landed there, and I worked there at Foothill for 6 years. The last 3 I described through a series of events like a Tom Clancy novel. I ended up as the vice president of instruction, where the first 12 people get knocked off, you're 13th. Now all of a sudden you're president. That's kind of what happened. And I served as the vice president for instruction for a couple of years. And I joke with my friends that I had therapy after that event. I'm now a productive member of society again. It's a great job. I really would encourage you to do it. Yeah. So I've also spent my entire time, so my 12 years in the community college system, all of that time I was doing consulting on the side. Because I've been doing this kind of work of helping companies use data in authentic ways and understand data. And this happened to be something that the community college system had worked on. I worked with a group in California called the RP Group, which is a research and planning group. And more recently, I was asked to kind of head up a national strategy for the RP Group about 4 years ago. And so I got to work on these really interesting projects nationally, like completion by design. It's one of the ones I spend about half my time. I'll talk about that a little. And you'll see a lot of completion by design in the AACC report on empowering, on kind of the implementation guide. I've also gotten to work on the Aspen Prize for Community College Excellence. We run all the site visits on the schools who are identified as the 10 finalists. So I've gotten to go deep at these schools who have produced, say what you will about the methodology of the Aspen Prize, and it's certainly not picking the best community college in the country. No one at Aspen ever says that. But what it does do is it identifies excellence in the sector. It's attempting to identify what excellence looks like and provide examples for the rest of the country of colleges that really have moved the needle on student success. So you'll hear me fold this throughout the day, what we've seen at these finalist schools. And one thing you're probably already going to sense is I have this incredible sense of optimism about where we're going to go in the next 5 years based on what I've seen going on nationally, what I've seen at colleges, and as Larry said, what's going on with practitioners like yourselves. At the end of the day, I go home, and you're the ones who are making this change happen on the ground. And I work with colleges around the country on the type of changes we're talking about. But I'm very excited about what I've seen nationally. And I'll fold in some of the Aspen Prize stuff. I've worked on Carnegie Statway, Quantway, alternate math pathways projects. I work with Achieving the Dream. I work with a couple of Lumina projects. One of the most interesting ones, stay tuned, this will be coming out this summer. We're working on a project to deal with low-income students and the financial stability that they need to actually increase student success. I'll share a slide with you later that I found really interesting, which was that if you look at the highest income quartile of students and the lowest income quartile of college students, we have this fundamental belief that college is a meritocracy, right? The smart kids will succeed and we may need to weed out the others. If you don't believe that's our historical model, that really is our historical model. And so if you look at the data on this, it's really interesting. If you look at the highest income students, the lower test score group from the higher income students graduates at higher rates than the highest test group from the lowest income students. It's a very sobering thought. So your highest achieving low income students, by the way, graduate at 26% nationally. Only 26% of those students graduate. It's 30% for the lowest ability group in the high income. 70% for the upper end of that. So 70 versus 30 graduation rate in colleges. High income versus low income. I think that's a pretty sobering thought. So we're working on something this summer to help colleges serve their low income students. So I've been very fortunate to work with a great group of partners nationally on these projects. I've been in about 200 rooms like this in the last 5 to 7 years, talking with and exploring this stuff with practitioners. So we're going to get into that today. But how many of you have seen me present at national conferences before? Oh, that's good news, because I have a couple of jokes I do as an intro. So I get tired of telling this. I feel like I have told these jokes too many times. But it's a new room, so we're going to do them again. So I have had these 200 presentations-ish. I wish that was an exaggeration, but it's not. And so I've amassed a series of presentation stories, like the best and worst of presentations. And so some of the things that I'm not fond of, I'm often asked to present over lunch, which is my second least favorite spot to present. This is you sit in a room like this in the morning. Normally the presentations, hopefully this one won't be, are not all that exciting. You finally get a chance to talk to your peers, you're at lunch, you're having a good time, you're talking, and they stop you 15 minutes in to bring some guy up like me and talk over your lunch with the people clearing their tables, and it's not a good spot. I've presented, if those of you, if you did know me, you'd know what a tragedy this was. I've presented at happy hour at a conference. I mean, I guess this is a good, if you want it to be the shortest presentation, I'm the guy who wants to be on the other side of that, who's saying, I can't believe they're bringing someone up to do this at happy hour. I've presented on the fourth day of a 4-day conference at 8 a.m. in New Orleans. I can't think of, when you're out at 2 a.m. on Bourbon Street, you're looking around at the group you're with, I'm like, you guys are the ones who are going to be in this presentation. Why don't we just do it now? And it was pretty much true. 8 a.m. is not a good spot for that. I presented in Dallas at the Dallas County. It's the first time Dallas has, I think, 6 colleges. First time they'd ever gotten all of their faculty and staff together in one room. It was like 1,200 faculty and staff in this huge gymnasium. And their chancellor at the time, Dr. Wright Lassiter, who I just love, old kind of bulldog guy. He kind of looks like a bulldog, talks like this gruff voice. He calls me over. He's like, Rob, no pressure here, but the last person to present on this stage was President Obama on Wednesday, so good luck. Gets better. So that was enough, which actually was twice in then a month. I presented in North Carolina right after the convention there on the same stage, too. So I somehow feel connected to the president. But after he introduced that, he goes up, he said, oh, and by the way, we're going to have our student choir come up before you go on and kind of start the morning. Okay? So there's amazing student choir comes up and does like 2 numbers from Rent and Wicked, like all this fired up. It's crazy. And then, so they walk away and Wright walks up. He's like, and now here's Rob to talk about data for 3 hours. It's a good, solid presentation there. I have fallen off a stage before, and you'll see me wandering around the room a lot. That actually, I've also fallen through a door during a presentation. So I was at a conference in California at one of those breakout rooms with the kind of dividers. And so my colleague was presenting, and I just kind of walked over here, leaned on the wall. This is absolutely true. It wasn't a wall, by the way. It was a door. Looked like a wall. So I fall into the next room, sprawled out, and is the next room empty? Of course, no. It's not empty. There's 75 people in there, too. And true story. So I actually give myself a little bit of credit. What I did is I popped up and said, how's everyone doing in here? You guys good in here? I'm going to go back over there. So that's, yeah. And so, but my favorite presentation story does not involve me directly. It was someone in California at a conference that I was at. And so a couple things here. You can always tell when someone's walking up to the stage what you're about to get for the next 45 minutes. You know, if someone walks up like this, you know you're going to get them reading their notes for 45 minutes. So this guy's already got strike 1. He's presenting over lunch. Same exact scenario. 2, he's walking up there like this. 3, his topic was, he was a reporter from the Sacramento Bee, and I think his topic was why you have less power than the, janitorial union in California, you community college folks. It was like titled almost that badly. And so he walks up there, and so we're at a Southern California hotel. And so this is one of those conference rooms that kind of looks out over the grounds of the hotel, and it happens to look out over the pool. You might see where this is going. It's actually better than that. So he's walking up to the podium like this, and there's a door right here from the hotel. So as he's walking up, the door opens, and out walks, absolutely true, the Miss California fitness pageant swimsuit competition photo shoot. I swear to God, 20 women in bikinis walk out behind this guy and essentially are doing their photo shoot like right here, behind an open glass window. And so my thought on this was, if this guy ever had looked up from the podium, which he did not, he would have had the best eye contact anytime during one of his presentations ever. So I joke about this stuff. The reason I do that, we do incredibly serious work, and I'm incredibly passionate about it and optimistic about it. You got to laugh a little along the way. This is tough work that we do, but I will share that the number one thing that I want to share is a sense of optimism for what we can do. We see this around the country, and it's not, a lot of what we're going to talk about isn't easy, but we're going to talk about some of the things we've seen. And what I'm going to talk about this morning in the first part is this whole discussion around data and a culture of evidence, a culture of inquiry. And I'll get into this in a second. So first thing to say, I've talked about getting to work with an incredible group of national partners on things like completion by design and Aspen. You know, I get to work with folks from CCRC all the time, right up the road from you guys, Davis Jenkins and the team of folks there, folks from Jobs for the Future in Boston, JBL Public Agenda, a lot of great people around the country doing this work, all of whom realize that at the end of the day, it's what you're doing on the ground that really matters. And whatever we can do to provide different ways to think about the work we do research on it, that's what we're really here for. You're going to see some pretty cool infographics here. One of the things about data that I think is a really important point is very few people look at a spreadsheet or a table of data and instantly are overwhelmed with passion by the insight they generate from a table, right? You can put a table up here, and most people, by the way, do not glean information from tables very well. There's really good research on this. So this is one of those things for IR folks, it's a challenge. I'm not good with graphics. If I was good with graphics, I probably wouldn't be in the field I am. But it's incredibly important when you're presenting to practitioners that you present the information in a way that people can get their heads around it and they can have a conversation around it. So I have a colleague who's one of the best in the country at doing infographics. He's studied this deeply. And Greg Staub from California, who most of the infographics you're going to see are from him. And so I do think it's an incredibly important point. Okay, so here's where we're going to start. I want you to give me kind of your first reaction. You don't need to do it verbally, but I'm guessing some of you will. To the following list of words. This is what I call formalistic doublespeak. Accountability, accreditation, assessment, continuous improvement, data-driven decision-making, evaluation, key performance indicators, logic model, performance-based funding, and strategic planning. Does anyone get really excited when they read these list of words? By the way, there are some of you. I know you don't want to admit that you do. But there are It takes a special kind of crazy to have this stuff fire you up, right? I don't have it, by the way, that special kind of crazy. But there are people who get very excited by the concept of accountability or the concept of strategic planning. One thing on here I'll come back to a little later, this term data-driven decision-making. No piece of data in the course of time of history has ever made a decision. This is an important concept because for me it's what distinguishes between a culture of evidence and a culture of inquiry, which I know sounds like some new agey thing from California that the guy in the Hawaiian shirt's saying. I actually think it's a really important concept. We had this is exactly, by the way, what happened in industry in the late 90s. There was this idea that the data will set us free. Right? All we need is more data. We need evidence. And this concept of evidence-based decision-making or data-driven decision-making, you get where this is going, right? The idea is that you should look at evidence, but evidence doesn't make decisions. I've got some pretty powerful studies in here that I think really suggest a call to action, but they still don't make decisions about what you should do. And we have this tendency to think that the data is the answer. I'm going to show you some examples of this in a minute. But I think it's really important to think about the fact people have to interpret data. They have to engage with it. They have to generate insight from it to get to action. So we'll come back to this one. But the point of this slide is we don't get fired up, practitioners especially. You guys are faculty, staff, and administrators. I've been there. Used to teach psychology part-time as well. No one gets fired up by these words. It's just not the course of doing business to think that we get fired up by this. However, it's important that we do a lot of this stuff. So I think that the imagery you all had in your heads is really important to realize as we go into this work. What this is really about, you've been beaten over the head with these phrases in the last 10 years. For the most part, these phrases are used as a weapon. You need to do this because we have accountability issues now. Accreditation tells us we need to do this. If we don't have a culture of continuous improvement, we're going to get in trouble, right? They're not used to drive, there's no passion in any of those words. There's not dealing with what people care about on the ground. And so I actually would argue that the other part of this is, for the most part, we haven't looked at what's come out of those words, especially faculty and staff on the ground, as actually having led to anything that's authentic improvement, right? And again, I would also argue that the more formal the process, in my experience, the less likely it is to lead to authentic improvement. It's not that formal processes don't lead to improvement. It's that there's a big step between the process and what actually happens to make this stuff live, breathe, and be real in your lives. We're going to talk about some of that in a minute, too. I would say there's good news here, and the good news is you can do all of those things, the things captured by those words, in more authentic and less formalistic ways. How? You need to change the conversation. The conversation shouldn't be about accountability. The conversation should be about the things that you actually care about. And what you care about is students and their learning and improving their outcomes in lives. It's why the vast majority of us are here. It's not why all of us are here, but it's why the vast majority of us are here. People who tend to end up in rooms like this, it's more of the reason we're here. And not everyone's going to come along when you go down this path. The idea is when you can recast these conversations in, how do we create the conditions to get more people to join all of your presidents on that stage in a couple weeks? Not the only outcome, by the way, and Dr. Donahue is absolutely right about that. We'll talk about that segmentation in a second, too. If we recast our discussions in these framings, it's going to change a lot of how people view the idea of data and using data for improvement. I have this thought about this idea of not everyone coming along. When I think about org change, and this is a frame that was given to me by a former chancellor of the state California system that I really liked. She talked about there being 3 types of people in the world when you think about organizational change. Red light, yellow light, and green light people. And so the green light people are the early adopters, are the innovators. If you have a new idea, they're with you before you even had the idea, right? They're going to come with you. They're the ones who have all the technology first. They love innovation. And they do exist on all of our campuses. And then there's the red light people who, and you probably can immediately get a vision of this person in your mind on your campus, or these 3 people or your department, who if they were given data suggesting that the way they do something results in a 5% success rate, and the data on the way that we have on another model has a 95% success rate, they're never changing even if that data is true, right? You all know who those people are. It usually is a very vivid picture in your head of who those people are on your campuses or in your departments. And so let's hold them for a second. Then there's the yellow light people. These are the people on our campuses who, for the most part, are in the middle, right? They can be swayed either way. Too often we let them be swayed by the power structure of the red light people, but that's a really important group. So when you think about where org change has to happen on our campus, I think it's a really important concept that it is a limiting, it's not going to help you in the long run to try to create more green light people, right? Green light people were early adopters and innovators. That's a hard thing to create, right? So if you're trying to, and by the way, there's not a lot of, this looks like a bell curve on most of our campuses. There's only about 10% of the people who are like that. You could increase it by 50%, you're only going to get 5% more people to come on board. Or the other thing we try to do with org change is we try to convince the red light people to come along. It's not going to happen for most of those folks. You're not going to convince them. And so the key is you've got most of your people in the middle, these yellow light people, who are willing to be swayed either way. There may be departments where the distribution's different. I could name some of those departments at my old campuses. But for the most part, the key to a lot of this work is to try to give us frames, data, conversations that help the middle of the organization move towards the new way of thinking, right? And I think it's a really important concept. The other thing I would say about the conversations is people need to see their expertise acknowledged and integrated. Too often those words end up creating structures where the expertise of those on the ground, the faculty and staff, as well as the administrators, is not often integrated into the process. The process has become too formal. That expertise seems to go away, not be integrated into it. And people also need to see the effect of going into this work. Why do this if we're not going to try to change things, right? If you're going to get involved in a process of improvement, people actually have to see things changing and have it change for the better. Okay, so this is, I'm not going to do a lot of this theory-based stuff, but I want to kind of throw this out there. So here's something I use to I'm going to use this slide twice today, once in the morning, once in the afternoon. Here, I'm going to give you a scenario which is pretty common, which is, let's say it's opening day, and a very well-intentioned, well-meaning, and innovative president standing in front of a room like this, all faculty and staff up there, and says something along these lines, which I've heard dozens of times from said folks. And by the way, completion rate, we could talk for 45 minutes about the denominator of completion rates and the numerator, who goes into that, and have interesting discussions. In California, we had an outside researcher, one of those folks who likes to lob bombs at the community college system, come in and create a completion rate that had literally anyone who ever stepped foot on a college campus for the first time, no matter if they took one course for one unit, in the denominator. And she didn't count certificates unless they were 2 years in the numerator, right? So her success rate when she did that, she's like, you California community colleges, you guys suck. You're only 21% you only have a 21% completion rate. So we actually have a really good data system in California. We have many crazy things in the California system, but we do have a great data system. We had a vice chancellor sitting over the data who's been involved in some of the AACC stuff. And he said, all right, I'll tell you what. We'll call her Nancy, because it's her name. Well, I'll tell you what, Nancy. I got a completion rate too. My completion rate is going to put in the denominator Yeah, we'll take all first-time students, but we want to make sure they're on this path that they're trying to complete. So I'm only going to take students who've ever tried 12 or more units, and they've tried transfer-level math and English. Now, of course, this is ridiculous, right? Because you're removing all the people who don't get through Dev Ed, and frankly, that's most people, right? But just to make a point, he did this. And when he does that, by the way, he had a 64% completion rate. Yeah, you get people who take 12 or more units, and they actually try, they don't have to pass transfer-level math or English, they just try it. We do pretty well by those students. Now, it suggests, by the way, that we need to do different things to get people to that level, right? So you can manipulate. He also counted certificates of 1 year or more, by the way. You can get some pretty interesting completion. But let's just say for the second, we're going to ignore the methodology. We here at Johnstone Community College have a 40% completion rate. And so I, as president of that college, come up to the stage and say, you know what we're going to do? In 5 years, we're going to make it 50%. We're going to set the goal of improving our completion rate from 40% to 50%. Everyone's like, great, that's a great idea. Let's try to do that. Everyone sits in the room, we get all fired up, we talked about some initiatives. And then what happens is at the end of that, opening day presentation, you guys, the practitioners, go back to your offices, close your doors. I used to be a psych faculty. Close my door and say, what's my role in changing this completion rate from 40% to 50%? Like, I sit here. How do I fit into this larger picture, right? So one of the problems here is too many of these metrics exist at what I call a 30,000-foot level. These are summative, first of all, this is a 3 to 6 year, as Mary said, metric, right? So if you're going to track completion rates, you need to track over a long period of time. It's a number that most of us can't get our heads around and figure out what our role is in that. Now, that's actually part of the afternoon's presentation. We'll talk about making a better connection between all of our roles and improving completion. But so one of the things that I use this slide for is to talk about, well, we can start breaking it down so we can have things we can study that are more granular. So we have successful completion. We could look at the completion rate of, say, first-time students versus returning students. It's an interesting one, by the way. One of the things that I got labeled when I came to Foothill in the early 2000s was I would never have done this. They called me the myth buster because there are all these widely held and deeply held beliefs on campus that existed for 30 years that were largely completely false when you looked at the data. One of them, by the way, was at this campus is that our returning students do better than our first-time students. If you actually look at your data, you got to be real careful about that one, like generalizations like that, because returning students do better at what? What do actually returning students do a pretty good job at getting? What is the outcome they get more often? They actually get certificates pretty well. They do really well in certificate programs. Why do you think that is? Why would returning students do really well in certificate programs? Say it. Shorter period of time. What else? Yeah, they know what they want, right? They've been out in the field. They've seen what happens now that they don't have something that they want a career, right? They know what they want. And we, by the way, do have some first-time students who get that pretty early, too. We maybe do a better job of that. Returning students do really well in certificate programs. Interestingly, they actually don't often do well in degree programs. Why do you think that is? Time? Someone say time? Yeah, time, right? And by the way, how well do we do with like prior learning assessment right now? So they've done a lot of learning in the real workplace and on the job, and we, for the most part, ignore it all. And by the way, if they did things before that are more than 5 or 6 years ago, we might not take any of that stuff, right? We may have to make them redo math and English, and so we have all these things. It's hard for returning students to get back into that culture, which, by the way, is one of many reasons that for-profits have the allure they do, right? For-profits do. There are some issues we have with for-profits and loan debt and loan defaults and not giving students marketable wages. The better ones are better at that. But one thing I think this will come up in the afternoon presentation, think about why for-profits are so attractive to students. In this particular instance, they're given a promise that you can get through this in a year. We'll figure out how to it doesn't happen actually, but the promise of it is pretty clear. But first-time students actually do much better in degree programs than most returning students. It probably varies a little bit by college. But we can look at that relationship. We could look at things like the effective learning communities. This was all the rage in the mid-2000s. And there are some places who've done really well with learning communities. LaGuardia is one of them. Georgia State in the 4-year space. That's one other thing I should mention is I had a great opportunity last summer to look at some of the top 4-year schools in the country who have improved graduation rates, by the way, with populations who are pretty similar to ours. I'll weave my discussion of Georgia State through today. Georgia State's a really interesting college. It's in Atlanta. It's average SAT scores look a lot like what the slightly upper third of our students are. They had a 31% graduation rate 10 years ago, which actually is not that bad for an urban college like Georgia State. In the last 10 years, they have taken that graduation rate from 31% to 53%. They've improved it by 22 points. They've done a lot of things, and one of the things they've done great, they have an incredibly developed culture of inquiry. And I'll talk about this throughout the day. They've done a bunch of other things, but 31% to 53% at a time, by the way, when their average SAT entering score didn't go up. They said, we're going to get better with the students we already have. We're not going to try to find better students. If you don't think that little maxim is kind of sitting under the surface on many of our campuses, lots of folks on our campuses believe we would do better if we just had better students. Here's a little fact. We accept the top 100% of the graduating class from high schools. So the students are not going to change, right? Here's another interesting fact. At no point in American education history have there been higher test scores leaving high school on standardized tests than there are right now. The students are more qualified for college now than they ever have been at any point in history. Say what you will about standardized tests and whether that's actually true. That's a really interesting finding. When we keep saying over time, the students are getting less and less qualified, which in my opinion has a slightly coded version of they don't look like the students we like to think that college students look like. I don't even think it's like coded that well. We talk about those students and students these days, right? Well, when we democratized higher education through community colleges in the 50s and 60s, we have a student population that looks a lot different than it did in the 50s. I think a lot of that's still code from that time. But it's really interesting. So I'll feed in some of the Georgia State story throughout today. Learning communities is a huge part of there. They have opt-out learning communities. 80% of their entering students are in learning communities. Of cohort of 25, they go through the whole first year that way. So other things we can look at. The point of this is not that any of these is the right thing for you to look at, but that you can start looking at relationships and data that are more granular. But at the end of the day, what the world looks like to one of our students is that, right? And if you don't think this is what the world looks like to one of our students, try tracking their path through your institution. It's a very sobering experience. Look at a transcript, first of all. You do some transcript reviews of how people take courses. We're going to talk about that side of it a lot more in the afternoon presentation on kind of the ideas behind completion by design and other pathways type projects. The world is this complicated to your students. For this morning presentation, one of the things that I'm focusing on is we actually can study things that happen at each of these levels. We can study what the effect of taking an assessment test without adequate preparation is, right? We know 10 years ago we didn't know this. 10 years ago when you did focus groups with students, by the way, who just took the placement test, we did these. They look something like this. So say you get the student 10 students who just got out of the placement test process. And you'd talk to them and ask them, so tell me how you got here. You know, you're here in this room, you just took the placement test. And the story would, stereotypically go something like, well, I came to campus today to register, and they told me I couldn't register before I took the placement tests. So they sent me over to the placement office. I waited in line for 2 hours. I took the placement test, and now I'm sitting here with you. So then you'd ask them, so did they tell you what the placement tests were for? No, they just told me to come take them. Okay? Now we're going to talk about this issue in a second. No single event in their entire career with you at a community college was more important than that 90 minutes. It is the most predictive single event for how long it will take to graduate. It is the most predictive single event for if they will graduate. And I'm going to share some data with you in a minute from around the country that suggests this may be a huge problem that we've put this much weight on this period of time. But there are lots of places that have changed. How many of you have placement test prep programs now? Someone close. What's your program do?
Courses over the summer.
So do they take the courses first or after or both?
They take it first.
Take them first. Any of you have one of the ones that does it after? So you test Dev Ed, then you take the boot camp, and how does that work? We do both? Yeah, really interesting, by the way. Miami-Dade, as part of its completion by design redesign, put in one of these, a serious week-long boot camp in the summer. They would let the students test first, and anyone who tested pre-collegiate could then take one of these boot camps, and in a week they would retest. By the way, they ran these every week of the summer for over 8,000 students. So you want to talk scale. This is the largest community college in the country. And they found 50% of the students went up at least one level, and 25% tested out of Dev Ed altogether. Right? Now you wonder what happened to them when they got into the courses. They performed as well or better than students who tested in there directly. I'm not trying to, but I'm going to really harp on this placement test issue a couple times in the morning, because I think it's also a really illustrative point in another area. The point of this for this morning, though, is when you start studying things down at this level, you start studying things that are closer to your practitioners' lives on the ground. Things you can control, right? The relationship with the learning community, courses off pathways, the issue of missing counseling appointments. These ideas are more granular. You could come up with 50 others of these. But for this culture of inquiry presentation, the point is very few of you look at this and go, I have 3 things I want to study that's going to move this number, right? You got to go through that process. What you're thinking about doing is what you could have control over is more down here, right? Okay, so we'll come back to this in the afternoon, because the afternoon presentation is this chaos that we've let happen doesn't have to be this way. And if you think this chaos doesn't have an effect, you got to look at what it's doing to our students. You read Judith Scott Clayton from CCRC's The Shapeless River, which just talks about how navigating community colleges is like navigating a shapeless river in a boat at night. That's what it's like to navigate our schools. And again, we'll come back to this. I don't want to get into this too much now. All right, so let's get into this culture of inquiry and action stuff. I'm not going to get all frameworky on you or definition stuff. I want to get into some data exploration with you. But I do think there's a couple of important points here. So this culture of inquiry stuff, I think the important piece of this is that it's dialogue that's focusing on strengthening outcomes. Dialogue, really key point here. If you come out of one thing of the morning presentation, is that we actually have to intentionally create the time and space to explore the data we're looking at. If we don't, like Mary was saying, we're going to have data going into a vacuum. So what are some features of a culture of inquiry? So widespread access to user-friendly information on student outcomes. So this kind of smacks of what we need is dashboards. All right, here's my dashboard rant. Okay, so I was in industry in the late 90s working for a strategic consulting firm. And this was during the dashboard explosion in industry. Everyone wanted a dashboard, right? So the basic idea here is if people could just see the data, somehow this would all get better, right? So everyone wanted a dashboard. So I was the 27-year-old recent PhD in the back of the room going, so this is all cool, but what are these people going to do with the dashboard? What are they going to do differently now that they have the dashboard? Everyone would look at me. The people who I worked for would say, shut up, they're paying us $500,000. And the people on the other side would say, we need a dashboard. That's about as deep as this conversation got, right? So what would happen afterwards at the places who didn't think about this is if you had 100 people in the organization and 5 of them were power users ahead of time who really could play with the data, they massaged it, they used the data, and 95 largely didn't, you put in the dashboard, you didn't pay attention to the business process side, those same 5 still used the data, but now it was prettier, graphic representations. The other 95 didn't do anything differently because they didn't pay attention to the bigger issue, which is where do you expect people to use this data? How are they going to change the process around what their daily lives are to use the data? So there's nothing wrong with dashboards, by the way. But the dashboard itself will not solve anything because all it is giving people is access to the information, right? One question about whether it's the information they need, that's one important question. Lots of people put dashboards in on those high-level metrics I was talking about. You put a dashboard in to show you the top 5 institutional learning metrics at a 30,000-foot level. Most of the people can't do anything about that, right? Or their role's not as well defined. So you do need access to user-friendly information. And one thing about user-friendly is not handing someone 60 pages of crosstabs, right? No one's going to look at it, and if they do, they're not going to get anything out of it. User-friendly means that there is some summation of the data, usually in a graphic format, that is useful to folks. Encouraging people to ask a wider collection of questions. I'm going to come back to this one later. Reflective and dynamic discussions across constituency groups. You've got to get together and talk about the question that led to the data and the data itself. I'm going to share with you some data in a second. We're going to explore it together. And there was a key epiphany at my old college where I first presented this data. And that epiphany came from the lowest paid person in a room of about this size. She was a financial aid tech 1, probably making $18,000, and she asked the key question about the data that led to this epiphany. People have so much expertise with the world. Think about the college, who deals with the students the most? The financial aid tech 1 is probably the one that's on the, by the way, sometimes that person is another student at many of our colleges, but that person is the one who's on the front line with the students seeing their problems that they have with financial aid. The people at the front of the A&R window, they know exactly what's going on with students. And of course, faculty in classrooms. know exactly what's going on with students. Those of us who sat at dean and VP levels, we may remember what it was like to deal with students, but we're not dealing with it day to day. So those people are really, they know a lot about what's going on, and it's really important these conversations go across groups. We too often, the reason that's important is we too often wall things off and say things like, I teach psych, if those English faculty could just fix the whole writing problem, we'd be fine. Of course, the English faculty are saying if those people in psych would work closer with us to help us fix the writing, we all have this blame the next group problem. This is human nature. I'm a social psychologist, so I'm predisposed to look for this, but we do this a lot, right? It's easy to blame the other group. This culture, if it's going to work, has to, at its heart, have a sense of ownership over improving student outcomes. We have a great history of blaming the student, right? If the student was more prepared, if the student was more motivated, if the student was X, we'd be fine, right? We also have this fun history, and this is classic, where every sector of education blames the previous sector. The four-year schools blame us, by the way, for underprepared transfer students, which, of course, by the way, the data suggests that ours are actually more qualified to be in the junior year than many students who started there. But they blame us. Who do we blame? We blame high schools. The high schools just gave us better students. The high schools blame the middle schools. The middle schools blame the elementary schools. And universally, everyone blames the parents. Like, we're getting in line about that. If the parents just motivated students more, we all blame. But again, I point out, we do accept the top 100% of the high school graduate. Should we work with our high schools to improve the connection? Absolutely. We'll talk about that this afternoon, too. But at the end of the day, you have to have a fundamental belief that we can change things at our level. What I am here to share with you on the other side of this, not just the Aspen Prize, but all the stuff I've seen nationally, we actually can change these. I'll show you some data in a second. You're right up the road here, CUNY, the ASAP program. ASAP at CUNY is a program that takes students and they are in learning community cohorts. They are cohorts based on major. They are block scheduled. They have fairly intensive student services, and they have doubled the graduation rate with those students. It is possible to do these things. Same rigor, probably higher rigor actually, and they have doubled the graduation rate. Again, they do a number of things you might think we can't do for all students. By the way, they are doing it for all students in certain places. But we have to have the sense of ownership. And then you got to actually, you actually got to use the insight you generate to change something, right? This idea that we're going to actually move things along. So we've got this framework. Anytime you do this work, you have a framework. You might guess that I'm not a frameworky type guy. But we developed this for completion by design. I think it's important to take a look at. We're going to go through these, but explore how to improve outcomes, gather meaningful evidence, discuss it broadly, use it to inform change, and measure the impact of change. And it doesn't look any different from any kind of plan, do, study, act, or whatever the order of that is. Plan, do, study, act probably is not the right order. But I would argue, by the way, in the last 10 years, we've gotten lots of data in the community college in the last 10 years. There's been a data explosion in the last 10 years. We actually, so we've done, by the way, if there's two things we've done in the last 10 years on this page, we've gathered evidence. I skipped over meaningful for a reason. We've gathered evidence, right? Think about the data you've gathered for accountability, your state reporting, for accreditation, and ask yourself how often is that data actually used for improvement? Nothing against accreditors, by the way. They have the idea in mind that what they're trying to do is help us on this path of using data for improvement. I would argue that many of them, and I don't know about yours, I can talk about a couple others, have actually made it worse through their processes, right? They've actually made it worse by making the processes so overly formal that it takes away from the true authentic process of improvement that we'd actually need to focus on these outcomes, right? My favorite story on this is from Santa Barbara City College in my home state. It's easy, and they were Aspen Prize co-winner last year. It's easy to write off Santa Barbara in the national conversation as a rich college that sits on a hill over the ocean, largely because it's a rich college that sits on a hill over the ocean. It's the single most beautiful campus I've ever seen, by the way. It just sits on a bluff over the ocean. What's interesting about Santa Barbara, though, is they are an HSI. They are a Hispanic serving institution. They have over 33% of their students are low-income Latino students from the area, overrepresented, by the way, at their college to where they are at. So they actually do have this really interesting equity mission. But at Santa Barbara, they tell this story about they were one of the early leaders in California in the learning outcomes assessment movement. They had this great process where they actually used the data at the course, institutional, and program level for improvement. And so we did this site visit on them for the Aspen Prize. And they got ranked we use the National Center for Higher Education Management, Peter Ural and Karen Paulson, who are kind of the national experts in the use of learning outcomes. They rated each of the colleges for us on a 0 to 10 scale. And Santa Barbara came out one of the highest because they had a really good model And so we got there, and we asked them about it, and they're like, yeah, we had to stop doing that 2 years ago for accreditation reasons, because we had to get ready for the accreditation visit. So we actually had to stop our authentic process to make everything fit into the boxes so we could be ready for the accreditation visit. And this light went off in my head, and it just started, this click, this is what we've let it become, that to actually do, they were doing exactly what we wanted them to do, but to fit it into this formalistic model, they had to take time off to work it back in there, and they stopped doing what they were doing. So I think this is really important, the idea that we're actually gathering the evidence. So we're going to talk about this, exploring how to improve student outcomes. So how do we spend our time at colleges? I'll ask you this question. I've asked this question in 100+ rooms in the last 3 or 4 years. When was the last time you sat in a standing committee meeting on your campus that used evidence, some sort of data, to explore a key student progress, completion, labor market, or learning, or equity outcome for more than 20 minutes? So you're in a standard committee meeting. How many of you have done this in the last 3 months? And that, by the way, is the average number of hands I see every time, which is about 3 out of 100. Okay? Now, this is not a gotcha saying that your particular state or college is doing something wrong to not have these discussions. My point here is it is not standard operating procedure at colleges to do this, right? It's not historically been the role of colleges to do this. We actually have to change the culture to have these type of conversations, right? You guys, the Centers for Student Success, stuff that's happening at the state level, are trying to help more of these conversations happen. You have a state plan with the 3 goals. That's going to help feed this through. But if we don't pay attention to our campus structures, that stuff's just going to go into a vacuum, right? We've got to fold this into the conversations we have. So let me ask you this next question. What types of questions do we spend, historically, most of our organizational resources answering? The IR folks will be up on this one. What do we gather data on? Say it. Enrollment, right? We gather a lot of data on enrollment. Everyone knows enrollment, right? Whatever your measure of productivity is, or fill rates, like enrollment, fill rates, enrollment management. We know those numbers. We know head count sometimes. We know these kind of what I call process metrics, or feeding the machine metrics, right? Budgetary numbers, right? Enrollment, budget, fill rate. These, if you have academic deans in the room, you guys know that that's what you're, by the way, that job's fun. You're getting all the stuff from above, you got stuff from part-time and full-time faculty and students. That job actually might be harder than the provost job. But we spend most of our resources answering questions about enrollment, about fill rate, about budget, right? Now, none of those questions are unimportant, right? You have to run the college efficiently. The whole idea of running the college efficiently is interesting to me, though, because the question I ask is, why do we need to run a college efficiently? Is the goal efficiency, or is the goal to run it efficiently so we can do more things to improve outcomes? I think that second thing's a step, right? I would argue, historically, it has been more about budget and efficiency. And some of my best friends are finance people, but the good finance people, the ones who realize we're doing this so that we create the efficiency so that we can actually serve more students. So I think this is a really important point about where we spend our time and needing to shift the conversation. You don't automatically have the time and space on your campus to ask these questions, to sit down and talk about them, and to figure out plans about what to do next. You have to actually create that time and space, which is, by the way, not a commodity we have a lot of, right? So one of the questions to ask yourself is, where do we already have things we can use to recreate the conversation to more of what we're going to talk about today?